China is using the George Floyd protest as a propaganda tool to attack the U.S. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The United States is reeling after the killing of George Floyd. We've seen peaceful protests as well as violent rioting and looting across the U.S. And this has been a propaganda win for the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party is using civil unrest and racism in the United States to cover up its own issues with civil unrest and racism. Last week was the anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. That's when the Communist Party massacred as many as 10,000 peaceful protesters. And yet, every night on Chinese state-run media, we've been seeing this instead. Coverage of the protests in the U.S., along with the police firing tear gas, and in comes the National Guard. And of course, interviews with Americans talking about racism. As my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, says, this exposes rotten racism in the U.S. Yes, the U.S. is very racist, and China should know because they're an expert on racism. Like how that state-sponsored New Year event used blackface, or that ad for a laundry detergent so powerful it turns a dirty black guy into a clean Chinese guy. And how currently, black people are being evicted by Chinese authorities for being black. The Global Times saying the U.S. is dealing with rotten racism is kind of like the pot calling the kettle, I don't know what color. I don't see color. What I meant was, Chinese media are experts on American racism, like this program from Guanxia, which goes into the history of race relations in the U.S. Among other things, it implies that the FBI was involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And it praises the Black Panthers for their Marxism, calling their movement the closest the U.S. has come to socialism. It also accuses white elites of using Black Panther, the superhero, to cover up the real story of the greatness of the Black Panther Revolution. But since Black Panther, the superhero, came before the Black Panther movement, that is not what happened. That Guanxia video has over 2 million views. Now, while I pulled out some examples of the propaganda in that video, it also presents a lot of facts that are accurate. But it uses them to frame the U.S. as a country that has always been racist. So Chinese media is really having a field day right now highlighting the racism in America. But there's one thing they love even more: the protests in America. This comes as the Chinese Communist Party scrambles to deal with the anti-CCP protests happening in Hong Kong. The CCP has denounced the Hong Kong protesters as rioters, but the international community has shown a lot of support for the protesters. When the U.S. Congress passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act last year, Nancy Pelosi said the protests were a beautiful sight to behold. The Chinese Communist Party hates this. So now, they're trying to use the riots and protests over the death of George Floyd to accuse the U.S. of hypocrisy. Global Times wrote, "Watch out, beautiful sight in Hong Kong is spreading across the U.S." This article says, the current situation in the U.S. will not only expose the hypocrisy of many U.S. politicians, but also encourage the American people to rethink their actual national interests. I bet the Communist Party is hoping those national interests don't include supporting democracy in Hong Kong. By the way, the editor-in-chief of the Global Times, Hu Xijin, has an unbelievable conspiracy theory. He tweeted, "Vicious Hong Kong rioters obviously are mastermind of violent protests across the U.S." Yeah, that's not true. Also, if Americans did things the Hong Kong way, the protests here would be a lot more organized, with a lot less rioting and zero looting. But the Global Times editor-in-chief wasn't the only one taking to Twitter to spread this propaganda line. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying tweeted, "All lives matter. we stand firmly with our African friends. Right, as long as those African friends aren't in China, otherwise they'll be evicted from their homes. Hua Chunying also tweeted, "I can't breathe," in response to a US State Department official's message of support for Hong Kong. Ooh, good one. So good that Chinese state-run media took to Chinese social media to gloat about her sick burn, until some Chinese netizens began replying with, "I can't tweet," since Twitter is banned in China. Chinese propagandists didn't miss a beat, though. They simply deleted those complaints. And there's a reason for this. According to Daniel Russell at the Asia Society Policy Institute, it's a given that the Chinese Leninist political system will seek to exploit racial tensions in the US today, just as Mao Zedong did in the late 60s. Here's an example. This poster from 1968 says, "Statement by Comrade Mao Zedong, chairman of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, in support of the Afro-American struggle against violent repression." It talks about how the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was an act of counter-revolutionary violence and frames the civil rights movement as a class struggle against capitalism and imperialism. Sound familiar? China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian took a page from Mao to also exploit racial tensions. He said, "What is happening right now in the US once again shows the seriousness of racial discrimination and violent law enforcement by the police." But hey, there are real problems of racism in the US, and there definitely have been instances of US police using really excessive force on peaceful protesters. So, maybe the Chinese Communist Party has a point? Well, yes and no. The reason that the Chinese Communist Party loves to talk about racism in America is that they treat it as a type of original sin. The idea is that America was racist, which shows it will always be racist, and that makes it a giant hypocrite when it criticizes other countries. They want this kind of moral relativism so they can get away with all their crimes against humanity. Because think about it. What happened to George Floyd was horrendous, and you know about it because US citizens shot footage of it and uploaded it to the internet. This footage was then spread freely on social media, where we were all free to discuss it and be outraged. Media were allowed to report on it. People were allowed to protest, and the officers involved have been charged. And even when some protests descended into rioting and looting, the rule of law still applied. Police didn't start mass shooting people with live bullets. In the US, the right to peacefully protest is guaranteed in the Constitution. In Hong Kong, people are protesting because they're rapidly losing their freedoms, and even their right to peacefully protest is gradually being taken away by an authoritarian regime they don't get to elect, one that has no rule of law. It's okay to support the protesters in the US and in Hong Kong. It's also okay to denounce the rioters and looters and still support protesters in general. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party will use any bad thing that happens in America for propaganda. But just because America has problems, which we can fully acknowledge and talk about, doesn't mean Americans can't also point out China's problems. The Chinese Communist Party says that's hypocrisy, but it's not. If none of us were allowed to point out other people's problems unless we were perfect ourselves, then we'd all have to allow each other to behave badly because we couldn't say anything. Well, except for me. I'm perfect. What's that, Shelley? How dare you correct me? Correct yourself first. And now, it's time for me to answer a question from one of you, a fan who supports China Uncensored on Patreon. Bill Smith asks, "Chris, is it likely that the CCP will make a comeback after the CCP virus is over and overtake the US?" A really interesting question. So there are two sides to this. How the CCP is perceived inside of China and outside. Inside of China, it's really hard to know what's going on. But there are indications that the CCP virus, what I've been calling the coronavirus, was way worse than they said. And there already may be a second wave hitting the country. The virus was a huge blow to the regime's credibility. And on top of that, the lockdown is wrecking China's economy. The Chinese Communist Party uses propaganda about the coronavirus and the U.S. protests to tell Chinese people that China is still better than the rest of the world. And some people will believe that. But if the Chinese economy doesn't recover, the Chinese Communist Party may still be dealing with crippling unrest. But overseas, the CCP virus has made many countries around the world completely distrust the Chinese regime. The CCP's cover-up of the disease is why hundreds of thousands have died and economies everywhere have suffered. Add to that how transparently the Chinese regime lied about Hong Kong, and I think it will be increasingly hard for the Chinese regime to raise itself up as a responsible international player. The CCP has always used money to push its rule, but now people are coming to understand how much a little money costs the world. Thanks for your question, Bill. And if you'd like me to answer your question on the show, join the China Uncensored 50-cent army on Patreon. For as little as $1 an episode, you can help us continue to uncensor China despite YouTube's censorship and demonetization. Head over to patreon.com/ChinaUncensored to join. And be sure to check out our episode of America Uncovered, where we look at what's actually happening on the ground with the U.S. protests. And listen to our podcast about Chinese propaganda and the U.S. protests, where we go into more depth on China Unscripted. The links are below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.